One of the things that we sometimes forget is that the 19th century, for European Christianity, was a period of astonishing success. There's probably never been a period in the whole of Christian history in Europe when so many people have identified with Christianity as enthusiastically as they did in that period of time. It was actually a kind of high tide for Christianity. And part of our problem since then has been we've wanted to compare ourselves with that period, and that's difficult because it really was a period of amazing success. And part of the success of that period came from the ability of the church to connect with neighbourhoods and communities. If you look at all of our cities, and if you look at the cities that were built in that period of time, you'll see how again and again and again they are built around church buildings. And often those church buildings were paid for by local people. And the connections between the community and the church were very, very strong. So let's have a little think about some of that. The churches in the past, in the 19th century, were places that were trusted and that understood the communities that they served. They served them very, very well. Many of the great reforming movements of the 19th century actually started in churches, and so you can say that the Christian church actually generated and created the kind of society that we had for the good. Now, the truth of the matter is that since the middle of the 20th century, since the period of the two wars, that bond of trust has been lost for a whole variety of reasons. Now, that has meant that our conversation has become a kind of bewildered silence. We're not sure how to construct the conversation anymore, and sometimes the conversation only consists of churches saying to the people, "Why don't you come to our church anymore?" Now that's not much of a conversation. So the question is, how do we create a conversation again? How do we re-inhabit our neighbourhoods? How do we move back into the neighbourhoods? And that's a particularly important question when you think about where some of our churches are located. Particularly, you see this perhaps a bit more in North America, where you see these huge warehouses, which are often in parts of the community where nobody lives at all. And interestingly, they are constructed without windows. Now, partly that's to accommodate all of the technology inside the building, but it's not a coincidence that there are no windows. There's no connection with the community. In fact, people are often hoovered up out of communities to gather in these huge warehouses. And there's a movement now in North America, and I believe increasingly across Europe, to move back into neighbourhoods and to reconnect. But the question is, how do we make that conversation again? We'll tell this story in 1 second, but you can leave the slide up. I want to share with you two stories and then look at some principles that lie behind those stories. The first story comes from Geneva, and it comes from a conversation I had with two church planters, one who was Dutch and one who was American, and together they were planting an English language congregation in a French-speaking part of Geneva, trying to reach postmoderns who were more comfortable worshipping in English than any other language. Curious world we live in today. I said to him, Lamert, what are you trying to do? And he used this phrase. He said, I'm trying to change the conversation in Geneva between the church and the city. So I said, okay, what do you mean by that? He said, well, we're trying to reach postmoderns. And for postmoderns in this city, it's a bit like this. He said, imagine a huge banqueting table, groaning with the most luscious food. And all are invited to dine around this banqueting table, except for Christians, because Christians have been naughty, and they have to stand in the naughty corner. They're not permitted to come around the table. That's what it's like in Geneva. We behaved badly in the past. And so we're still in the naughty corner. So in order to come out of the naughty corner, we have to change the conversation. I said, okay, well, how are you doing that? He said, well, this is how we started. Last summer, he said, we had a campaign where we contacted 30 or 40 charities in the city that needed volunteers. And then we put out an appeal to the people of Geneva to say to them, would you be willing to give up a week of your time in the summer to volunteer in one of these organizations? And actually hundreds of people responded. You didn't have to be a Christian, they weren't Christian organizations. Interestingly, about 80% of the people that did respond were Christians, actually. And they put them in touch with charities. That was a simple thing to do in one way, but it had a dramatic impact on the city in at least a number of ways. And let me just give you two examples. When it came Christmas time, Lamert wanted to put on a series of presentations to explain the meaning of Christmas, and the best place they could find was in the centre of Geneva, which was actually a function room above an Irish bar. And they went to the owners and they said, can we rent your room? And they said, you can have the room, but you can't pay for it. They said, why not? They said, because we can't take money from you because you've done good for our city. That's interesting, isn't it? That's an indication that the conversation is beginning to change. And about the same time, he had a phone call from one of the charities that they'd helped. It happened to be a home for women who'd been abused, beaten, battered. It was a refuge for these women. And they had a phone call, and the phone call said this, Lamert, would you come and hold a service for us this Christmas time, a carol service, and would you preach from the Bible? And there was something about the way that was said that caused Lamert to say, why do you say preach from the Bible? And this is what they said. Other groups in the past we've asked to come and do carol services, but we haven't known them, we haven't trusted them, so we've said to them, you can come but don't preach. And so they've either refused to come, or they found a sneaky way to preach anyway. You, we trust. Preach to us from the Bible. The conversation is beginning to change. And I said to him, why do you think it's been so necessary to bring this change to the conversation? And we happened to be standing beside a statue of John Calvin, and he patted the statue and he said, this has been the problem. All the way back to Calvin's misuse of power has come the problem. So changing the conversation, it's very important. I want to tell you the story of this place. This happens to be a community centre in Weitwinkel where my wife and I live. We live just near to that, and this is where our church meets, and it's also the place where we actually operate the community centre because the previous people that operated it went bankrupt, and we were invited to take over the lease of the place. So we run it. We use it, and it costs us £1 a year, and we have a lease for the next 70 years, so it's quite handy. You can show the next slide actually, because this is in the grounds we have a lake, and you can see the building reflected in the lake. So it's very popular for weddings and all that kind of thing. Okay, so thinking about the community centre. And thinking about our relationship with the community, when we first took over the community centre, we realised that the community centre actually was very little used. In fact, it had become a bit of a problem because the parkland that you see in the picture had become a place where drug addicts used it, and so the first task every morning was to pick up used condoms and to pick up needles. People were afraid to walk through the park. So we had to think from the beginning, how do we construct a conversation between ourselves and the community? Now the first thing we did was we asked the community what they thought of the church, and actually we were a bit shocked, because the first thing we learned was they didn't think very much of us. In fact, a very common response that we were getting was, oh, that's the church that's only interested in money. We thought, wow, how have people got hold of that impression? You know, it really isn't true. We're not just interested in money. So, what's going on? Here's what we discovered. Quite early on in this exercise, we'd had a manager of the community centre, and they'd received a phone call from the local parent-teacher association to say this: we'd like to use your car park to assemble the children going to school as a kind of walking bus. That's probably an English term, that walking bus. It's where the kids gather in a place and then walk the last kilometre to school. So a walking bus. Can we use your car park? Our centre manager, unknown to us, said yes, it will cost you X. They went berserk. They were furious. Whatever you do, do not antagonise the local parent-teacher association. They have got jungle drums that go through the community like nobody's business. And so the word went out, those people are just interested in money. So the second thing we did was we went to the community and we said, what do you think are your needs? And interestingly, they came up with some needs that we wouldn't necessarily have thought of. The first need they expressed was, there is no playground for the under-5s in this neighbourhood. We thought, wow, that's true, we hadn't noticed. The second need they expressed was, there's no place for us to sit and talk to our friends in this neighbourhood. We thought, yeah, that's true, we hadn't noticed that. So we thought, what could we do about that? So the first thing we did was we raised €100,000 and put up a children's playground next to the community centre. Can you imagine what that did to our relationships with the community? Immediately they recognised that we had not done that for ourselves. They realised we'd done it for them. And the second thing we did was we opened a cafe next to the playground so that people can have a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, and their children could play in the playground next door. That was the beginning of changing the conversation with our local community. So a couple of stories there. So let's look at some of the principles that underlie that. So let's just take a quick look. We'll be very brief. First of all, our first principle is this: God is the God of mission, and He is busy in our community. The question is, do we know what He's doing? So the first skill that we have to cultivate is listening and looking for the presence of God. God is very busy in our neighbourhoods if we know where to find Him. Second principle, just coming up in a second. The second principle is thinking about the tables that we might construct. Now what I mean by that is simply this, that if you look at Scripture, amazing things happen around table. The wedding at Cana in Galilee, the number of times that Jesus went to tables to have food with Pharisees, the occasions when He had meals with those who were sinners. I love the story of Zacchaeus. Fantastic story. Come down from that tree, Zacchaeus, because I'm coming to your home today. And it was around table that Zacchaeus' life was changed. So the second principle is, how do we construct tables that we can invite people to for conversation? Third principle, who are the people of peace in a given neighbourhood? It's fascinating, isn't it, how you see pieces in Scripture that you somehow don't notice no matter how many times you read the Scripture. This was a Scripture that I hadn't noticed in Luke 10 until somebody from India said to me, this is how we're planting churches. We train people to go into villages and they are to pray publicly in the village where there's no church until someone asks them what they're doing, and that is the person of peace in whose home the church is going to be started. I said, that is completely crazy. He said, I know it is, but we planted 650 churches that way in the last 5 years. So I thought, okay, on that basis, I'll take a closer look at this craziness. And I began to think about actually the moments when we've been successful evangelistically, and I began to realize that mostly that was centered on people of peace. I could tell you a lot of stories about that, but let's leave it there for the moment because we're short of time. The fourth principle is how we reconnect with our neighborhood, how we begin to re-inhabit our neighborhood. And I described a couple of those stories already, how we listen and then how we do the next thing, which comes up any second, which is responding to the needs that we identify. How do we respond to needs? And then lastly, I think, what we're really talking about, at the end of the last section, I began to talk about creating mediating spaces. This is what we're really trying to do with all of this. We're trying to create mediating spaces. And the fundamental conversation that we're really wanting to have with people is not just the conversation about Jesus, though that is incredibly important. I'm very committed to the conversation about Jesus. But I'm also committed to this other basic question. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to flourish as human beings? And what does it mean to flourish as human communities? You see, if we can have that conversation, then you can be absolutely sure that the conversation about God emerges. Because we cannot be fully human, we cannot flourish as human beings, we cannot flourish as human communities unless God is also in the picture. Wouldn't it be amazing if at the centre of every community it was the church, Christians, that were hosting a conversation with local communities, involving other stakeholders, involving the authorities, the city authorities, involving trade unions, involving political parties, involving the local educational establishments, involving the schools, involving anybody that's interested in the conversation, and using our space to just host a conversation and using our imagination to say, use our cathedrals, use our spaces to have the conversation that actually matters to this community, to this city, to this town, to this village. Changing the conversation lies at the heart of mission. Thank you.